Hi guys! I know that in a lot of my recent silhouette-based pages, I've received a lot of feedback from you guys that not everyone has a silhouette, and I totally get that because they are a hefty investment in your crafting, and I know that not everyone is able to have that. So what I wanted to do today is to just point out that there are other ways to use cut files without using a silhouette. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways today. I have started in Photoshop, but to be honest, you can use this technique with any sort of printing program that you've got. You could probably even do this in Word. I'm just using Photoshop because that's what I've got. I've started by opening a new canvas, Command N, and I've sized this the same size as my Traveler's Notebook spread. So if I add in a guideline here to halfway, you can see these are the 2 pages of my Traveler's Notebook. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to use my cut file in my Traveler's Notebook. So feel free to use any size that you want. Now I'm going to add a cut file on here, so I'm going File, Place, and I have chosen this free, I say free cut file from Citrus Twist for September. So this is the joined circles, and I'm just going to place the PNG file onto my page here. I am, however, going to turn it around so it is sitting in the middle of my page, and just hit enter. Now, the techniques that I'm going to show you today, you do need to be a tiny bit selective with what cut files you choose. I would probably start with something basic. This is probably reasonably easy to do a couple of these things. We're going to cut these cut files by hand and use them as a stitching guide. So you need to bear that in mind as you are selecting which cut files to use. But given that there are so many great cut files, and especially free great cut files around at the moment, this is a couple of good techniques to use even if you don't have a silhouette. Now, before I go ahead and print these, what I want to do is I don't want to print them fully black like this. If you were going to use this just as a stitching guide, it probably doesn't matter. You could print it however you want, but for the hand cutting version, I want to make sure that I'm printing it really, really light. So I'm just lowering the opacity. Or if you aren't using Photoshop, there are a couple of ways around this. You can choose a draft print as you print it. So you're just trying to print it as light as you possibly can. Or else I will show you another workaround that when we get to the actual cutting. So for now, this cut file is really easy just to print as it is. If you have something specific, and I'll just lay another one on top here to show you, there is an ABC one that is really cute, again free from the Citrus Twist. If you were going to print this one to cut by hand, you would need to make sure you had reversed it before you cut it, because we're going to be cutting from the back, so when you flip it over you don't want it to be backwards. So you literally just select your cut file here and go Edit, Transform, and Flip Horizontal, and that way when you print it and cut it, it will be the right way around. I, however, have selectively chosen one that is going to make no difference whether it's front or back, so I'm going to go ahead and print this now. For my stitching template, you can print it on whatever paper you've got handy, just some regular printer paper. That's not going to be our final stitched piece. And for the cut version of it, I am going to print it onto some 210 GSM card so that it makes it really easy for me to cut out later. So now that I have printed out my cut file, I am going to show you 2 different techniques, and the first one is hand cutting it. So you're going to need a cutting mat and a really sharp knife. I've got a little scalpel here, but you can use whatever knife you want. It does pay for it to be super sharp though. Now I've printed mine out full size, so I'm just going to trim this down the middle, and that will give me the 2 sides of my Traveler's Notebook. It won't matter which side I'm going to use because I did selectively choose this cut file for it to be really easy to work with. And so all you're going to do is cut out the pieces that aren't printed. So you're basically cutting out all of the white, and that will leave you with the cut file. Now obviously cutting these out by hand is never going to look as neat as it would be cut on a silhouette, but you do still get the look of a cut file without having to make that investment of a silhouette machine. So just take your time, be very, very careful because you are using a knife. Take your time, cut out the pieces. It does take a little bit of time. Obviously, this is not as fast as just using a silhouette machine. You can't just walk away. You do have to pay attention to what you're doing, but it is totally worth the effort in the end. Now to make cutting easier, always be dragging the knife towards you. Never try to push it away from you. You've got much better control when you're pulling towards you, and make sure that you keep your blade as flat to the mat as you can. Not using the tip, you're trying to use the entirety of the blade. You'll get a much smoother cut that way. You don't need to apply heaps of pressure, just enough to go through the paper. If you find yourself gouging out the cutting mat, you're probably pressing too hard, and the harder you press, the more likely you are to slip and potentially hurt yourself. Now, because I use pocket page notebooks a lot, and this is what I'm going to use this particular cut file in, I don't want to be able to see the printed image on the back side of my cut file. So if you didn't mind that, you could always change the color of the cut file so that it printed in a color that matched your layout. But instead what I'm going to do is use this printed out cut file as a template for cutting a piece of vellum. Now there are a few options for doing this. The first is you could trace your cut file onto your vellum with a pencil and then go ahead and use that traced line as your cutting guide with the knife, the exact same way we just did with the printed piece. And then once you finish cutting, you could very carefully go around with an eraser and erase out any pencil marks that you can see. Or the other option is just to freehand it. So I'm just going to line up my vellum on top of my print file, and I'm going to add a couple of pieces of washi tape just to make sure that my vellum doesn't slip around. And then I'm going to just start cutting through the vellum. It doesn't matter if I cut through the printed cut file underneath. I'm just using that as a guide. So you do have to be a little bit more careful with this option because you do have to hold the vellum relatively steady while you're cutting, but it means you don't have that second step at the end of having to erase all the pencil marks. So you can see I'm just using a light enough pressure to cut through the vellum. I'm not cutting all the way through the printed piece on the bottom. It doesn't matter if you accidentally do, but the point is to find a nice pressure. And you can see I'm not following my own advice there. You can see how hard it makes it when you try to cut away from yourself. When you're cutting towards yourself, it means you've got more control and can hold that paper flatter. So like I said, this does take a little bit of time. I think overall it took me about 20 minutes. I've sped this up so you don't have to watch the entire 20 minutes of me cutting. I do cut all the inside pieces first, and then once I've finished cutting all of the insides, I can work my way around the outside, which will release the cut file from the paper. And there you have one cut file ready to use without the use of a silhouette machine. So the second option for using these cut files is as a stitching guide. So for this stitching guide, I am just going to trim the cut file out as close to the edge of it as possible. That way you'll be able to see exactly where you're placing your stitching guide onto the piece of paper that you want to stitch on, which I am just going to use this Traveler's Notebook sized piece. I want to make sure that I'm adding my stitching guide as close to the bottom of this piece as I can. Now I'm going to use some washi tape to hold that in place again, and then I'm just going to add my punching mat underneath and use a drawing pin and just go all the way around the outside of this printed piece, punching holes through both pieces of paper so that I have a guide to do my stitching in my final piece of paper underneath. So once you've finished punching holes all the way around your stitching guide, you can remove that. You no longer need that. You may want to keep it for another time. For my stitching, I'm going to use embroidery floss, which is normally 6 strands, and I have split that so that there are 3 strands through my needle. I am using an embroidery needle because you have pre-punched the holes. You don't need a super sharp needle, so an embroidery needle works perfectly. I pull the thread through from the back of the paper and just attach the tail with a little piece of washi tape. Knots tend to get a little bit bulky, so the washi tape is a perfect solution. And then I am going to do a simple back stitch all the way around this piece of paper. Now this is going to take a long time, and I am definitely not going to make you watch this. In fact, I am going to stop the camera and go and watch a little bit of TV while I finish stitching this up. So I'm back later on, and I have my 2 finished pieces made from my cut files. Now don't forget that if you know where your photo is going to go, there's no need to stitch underneath there. All I did was add my photo onto my paper and make a few pencil marks so I knew where I did and didn't need to stitch. This does mean, of course, that you're going to be stuck with that photo placement, so if you're even a little bit unsure where your photo is going to go, I would go ahead and stitch the whole thing. And so now that I've got my 2 finished pieces, I can go ahead and put this page together super quickly because I've already done all the hard work. I've got a full page photo and I've stuck that onto the right hand side of my pocket page notebook, and then I am just going to, I want to say slip, but as you can see it took a little bit to get the cut file into the pocket. So I'm slipping my vellum cut file into the pocket, and then my stitched piece I'm going to stick down onto the left hand side. So you can see all the stitching and washi tape on the back of this piece. It does make it a little bit more difficult to stick down, so I am making sure I use some double-sided tape so that that stays into my notebook nice and securely. Now I already know where I want my photo to go, but I'm not really sure what I want to do with the rest of the page. I've got my September scrapbook kit here, and I want to keep it simple. I mean, I've already done a lot of work for this page for what is a fairly simple looking page, so I want to make the work that I've already done the highlight of the page. So really all I'm going to add is some of these beautiful gold puffy stickers. That's going to be the title of my page, and it will just highlight the stitching in the cut file that I've already used. So I'm just sticking that across my full page photo, and before I stick my smaller photo down, which is a 3x4, I think I want to back it with some paper just to lift it off the stitching a little bit. So I've chosen this really beautiful pink pattern, and I'm just going to add a tiny little mat. It's not a huge amount, but just enough to tie the pinks from both sides of the page in together. Because those gold puffy stickers on the right hand side are quite a large element, I want to add a little bit of that gold onto the left as well. So I'm adding one of the gorgeous gold puffy stickers, the puffy hearts, and then adding a couple more on the right hand side as well. That just helps to tie the 2 pages together. And then all I'm going to do is add a little bit of journaling with my white Jelly Roll pen directly onto my photo and call this page done. So don't forget that just because you don't have a silhouette machine doesn't mean you can't take advantage of the amazing free cut files in the Citrus Twist shop. I will leave the link down below. If you've got any other ideas for ways to use cut files without a silhouette, make sure you leave them in the comments down below so that we can all take advantage of them. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. If you want to keep watching, there's a couple more videos on screen. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Bye!